or to me as we go. So Professor Estrepo, would you like to take it away?
Of course, Jessica, thanks so much. Let me start sharing my screen.
And yeah, thanks again for coming. We really, really appreciate it.
Perfect. Is everyone seeing this?
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect. Let me just make sure that I put some of the participants here just so that I can see some of you while I'm talking. Wait. Awesome. Great. Okay, perfect. Okay, so thanks to Jessica and the organizers for inviting me. It's truly a pleasure to be here. During this year, I've given many seminars, but this is by far the most exciting one that I've attended. And it's because it is really great to see so many young people coming together on a Saturday to talk about economics and learn new stuff. So that is really like what has me very happy today. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. So I'm going to be thinking about automation, technology, and how that affects the labor market and the future of work. But besides the specific topics that I'm going to cover, I hope that this presentation is also going to help convey the idea that economics is a very powerful tool that can be used for thinking very clearly about important social issues and issues that are of extreme importance when we are thinking about our society and the future of our societies as well. And so I want you guys to come out of here thinking that economics is kind of like these great lenses that are going to help us look at the world and understand the world much better and improve the world. So anyway, let me get started. So already mentioned that today I'm going to be talking about automation and the future of work. But before we jump to the future, let's start by taking a look at what has happened in the US labor market in recent years. This figure right here is plotting wage growth for men in the left panel and for women in the right panel since 1963. And this is a logarithmic plot, so that essentially going, for example, from 0 to 0.7 means that the wages of that group increased over this time period by 70%. Now, you can also see in both panels that workers with different levels of education are shown with different colors. So for example, the dark blue line are workers with a graduate degree, and the red line is showing workers who do not have a high school degree and that dropped out of high school. And so what you can see is that before the 1980s, we had kind of like this very unique episode of all wages growing together, and you don't see much inequality before the 1980s. But starting at some point in the 80s, you see that the wage distribution starts fanning out. So you see healthy wage growth at the top of the distribution, especially for women in the right panel. But then you also start seeing that for people with lower levels of education, so especially people without a college degree, their wages have become stagnant in the case of women, or they have even decreased in the case of men. So this means that inequality has risen, but it's not only that inequality has risen because wages at the top are rising much more rapidly than wages at the bottom. This is a little bit more problematic. It is showing that inequality has risen also because wages at the bottom have stagnated or collapsed. So in this presentation, I want to think about what's driving these changes in the labor market and what are the sources of this increase in inequality that we've experienced since the 1980s. Now, this increasing inequality is even more puzzling because when you look at college attendance, which is a measure of the supply of educated workers, you can see that college attendance has been increasing. So in particular, the figure in the left, the red lines are showing us the share of the workforce, that is the share of workers who have a bachelor's degree or a college degree, and the share of workers who completed a high school degree. And what you can see in both cases is that both of these lines have been going up over time. So for example, the share of workers with a high school degree went up from 50% in the 50s to about 90% recently. And the share of workers with a college degree went from about 5% of the population to 30%. So we made great advances in educating more of our workforce. So now let's do some economics and let's try to think about what's happening using a very simple supply and demand diagram. So let's imagine that in the vertical axis, or let's imagine that first this is the market for skilled workers. So this is the market for workers who have a college degree or more. And let's imagine that in the vertical axis, I have the price of these workers, which in the case of workers is going to be the wage that they're going to get in the labor market. And on the horizontal axis, I have the quantity of these workers. And so now I would like Jessica to pause the first question that I brought for everyone to think about. And then once you answer this question, we're going to discuss some of the economics using this diagram. So go ahead, read the question, and I'll give you a couple of minutes for everyone to answer it. Perfect. So it seems that there's already a clear winner, which is the third answer that tells us that the supply of skilled labor has expanded. This is what we are seeing in the figure on the right. So now let's try to think about the effects of this expansion. So the expansion in the supply of labor, of skilled labor, essentially would have reduced the wages that these workers are earning because they're becoming more abundant. And so if I have many workers with a college degree, that would have put downward pressure on their wages. But that's not what we see in the data, because we saw that wages at the top kept rising much more than wages at the bottom. So what must have happened? Well, it must be the case that the demand for these types of workers is going up much more than the supply, and that's increasing their wages, right? So you can also think about what's happening in the market for unskilled workers. This is going to be essentially the opposite situation. The number of skilled workers has been falling because we have managed to educate a larger share of the population. In the absence of movement in the demand for these types of workers, we should have seen their wages going up because they're becoming more scarce. But what we see in the data is that their wages have become stagnant or even fallen in real terms, which means that somehow the demand for unskilled labor must have shifted to the left. And so now we have our first interesting finding that we're going to discuss today. It seems that if we want to make sense of what's happening in the US data, then we have to think about factors that are increasing the demand for skilled labor, but reducing the demand for unskilled workers. And I'm going to argue that one of such factors is technological change, and in particular, automation. And I'm going to explain through many examples that technology has this feature that it can create winners and losers. And in particular, technology has this feature that it can increase the demand for highly educated workers who have the skills to operate the new technologies, while at the same time reducing the demand for unskilled workers who are going to be displaced or substituted by some of these technologies. So let's look at some additional evidence showing that indeed there is some reason for thinking that a lot of what we are seeing in terms of the labor market has to do with adverse shifts in the demand for some types of labor. So in this figure, I'm plotting the evolution of the participation rate. So what's the participation rate? Well, it's going to be the ratio between the population in the labor force. So that's the total amount of people who are working or that are unemployed but looking for work, divided by the population who are in a working age. So that's the population above 16 years of age. Now,
So
what you
Professor
can see,
Restrepo, are
yes,
you screen sharing right now or not yet? Just wanted
Sorry,
to
what
confirm. Are you screen
happened?
sharing? Are you currently screen sharing?
I am. You're not seeing my screen.
I am not. Is anyone else seeing the screen?
Okay, I think
Yes.
yeah,
Oh,
I think
okay. It might just be me then. Okay. Never
okay,
mind.
but people are
Okay.
seeing my screen. Okay,
Okay,
so
that's good. That's
thumbs
good.
up if you're
Okay.
seeing it. Okay, good. So
Right.
what you can
Okay.
see in this figure is that when you look at the participation rate for men, for example, it has been declining over time. So it went from 79%. So 79% of men that were above 16 years of age were working or looking for work in 1972 to about 70%. Now, what has happened to women? The labor force participation rate for women has increased over time as more women start entering the labor force. But then you can see that this growing trend in participation has also slowed down recently. So women were improving, but you see that something is slowing down the increase in their participation rate starting in the 90s. So let me bring the second question that I want you to think about. And this is a question about what are the potential drivers of this long run decline in the participation rate. Let's bring that question up, Jessica. Perfect. And this is a multiple choice question, so there's no single answer. Perfect. So it seems that most people agree that all of these factors might have contributed to the decline in the participation rate, right? Now, let's think about each of these factors one by one. So let's start by aging. So does any of you want to unmute and tell us why aging could reduce the participation rate of an economy?
You guys can raise your hand or put it into the chat.
Okay, I see number 60, Seb Van Santen. Go ahead, Seb. I think that we need to unmute.
Yeah, so basically, like the aging in the population could cause a decrease in labor force participation rate because as people get older, they start to retire more. So you have a larger percentage of retired people who don't want to work, so therefore less people are going to participate.
Absolutely. And that's something that we definitely see not only in the US, but also in many advanced economies, right? So the world is getting older. If you look at the share of the population who are above 65, that number has increased dramatically in recent years. And as Seb was mentioning, as people get older, they retire, they drop out of the labor force. So that's one force that is going to push down the participation rate. Now, of course, we can control for that in the data, right? Because in the data, we can also look at the participation rate of younger people. And if the participation rate for younger people is also falling, then this tells us that this is not only about demographics, but that this could also be about the second option in the poll, which was worsening employment opportunities. So if you're facing adverse employment opportunities, you're more likely to drop out of the labor force because you're going to be discouraged to look for work, right? So that's also called structural unemployment. And I know that there was a question in one of the Super Bowls in the past that was asking about this. So when you face adverse employment or a reduction in employment opportunities, you're going to drop out of the labor force. And so that might be something that could be happening to both men and women recently. Now, it is very interesting that when you look at this data, so for example, let's zoom in to men between the ages of 25 to 54. So I'm looking at this particular age bracket to get rid of the aging of the population that Seb was mentioning. So right now we're looking at prime age men. So these are men that should not be dropping out of the labor force based on their age. But what you see when you look at the participation rate of these men is that actually, even within this age bracket, participation rates have been declining, and the decline has been more pronounced for men without a college degree. So again, this is consistent with the idea that technology has reduced the demand for these types of workers, has worsened employment opportunities for these types of workers, And you see that as a consequence, both their wages are falling, but also their participation rates have been declining over time. Let's look at another piece of data that supports the idea that there have been major technological changes that can explain the increased demand for workers with college education or with high levels of skills at the same time as they reduce the demand for workers with low levels of education or no college degree. In this figure, I'm plotting the labor share of the economy and of different sectors. So just to remind you, the labor share is defined as the ratio of total wage payments to workers. So that is, in an economy, how much of the GDP of that economy accrues to workers divided by total GDP or value added if you're looking at a specific industry. Now, what the figure in the left shows is that, for example, when you look at the aggregate economy labor share, so this is the fraction of GDP that accrues to workers in the form of wages or compensation to workers. That has decreased from about 66% to about 54% since the 1980s. Now, this decline is also particularly pronounced in some sectors of the US economy, such as manufacturing, where the labor share declined from 65% in the 80s to about 45% in the 2012, more recent years, okay? So what this is telling us is that there's also a change in the way that the economy is producing, and that over time, industries are becoming more capital intensive. We are using much more capital to produce and less labor to produce value added, more so in some sectors like manufacturing, retail, or wholesale trade. So let me give you some examples of these transformations that are taking place in these sectors. In the left, you have a figure or a picture of how a car manufacturing plant used to look like in the 60s or in the 50s. So what you can see is that this was a very labor-intensive production technique that required workers to assemble all of the parts, put them together, weld the parts, then paint the car, and so on. And in the right picture, you see a car manufacturing plant today. So what's the main difference? Well, you don't see many workers anymore in these sectors. All you see are those big yellow arms that are called industrial robots. So we shift from producing cars in a way that relied extensively on unskilled workers or workers without a college degree, but that were able to supply their labor and their work, to producing cars using mostly these industrial robots and also software that controls these robots or other types of specialized machinery. So this is the type of technological shift that you're going to see. Now, how many workers are there in the right-hand side? Well, in the picture in the right, if you actually look carefully, there are a couple of workers. So there's still workers, but those workers are going to have very different skills from the workers in the picture in the left. So probably this factory still needs engineers and software developers to program the robots, but it's not going to need blue-collar workers to put the cars together. And so this is one example of a technology that shifts the demand in that industry. And now it is increasing the demand for skilled workers at the same time as it is reducing the demand for unskilled labor. Now, we don't see this only in manufacturing. You also see this in services. So in the left-hand side, you have a picture of clerical workers. So essentially, in the past, and you are all too young to know about this, but if you wanted to book a trip, for example, you have to call a travel agent. If you wanted to buy things, you had to call salespersons that would do the sales from some customer service posts. And customer service was actually done by people, not by software. And so this is how it was done in the past. But now, of course, if you want to buy a plane ticket, all you need to do is log into your computer or use an app for doing that, which means that instead of using all of this labor that was employed in these clerical jobs, we are just using software for that. So this is also part of that transformation. And what that implies is that the economy is again increasing the demand for people with college skills, the skills required to design those apps and so on, but is reducing the demand for people without those skills. So in this picture, the people who used to be employed in those clerical tasks. Now, of course, this is not new. If you think, for example, of the Industrial Revolution, so this is kind of like one of the first examples that we are given of technological progress. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, we used to produce textiles manually. So in particular, we used to have artisans who were working from home using manual intensive techniques. So that's the picture in the left. And then with the invention of what, and again, this is a question to you. There's no question in the poll, but just a question in case one of you wants to unmute yourselves. What was one key machine that substituted those workers in the left? Developed during the Industrial Revolution. This is more like of a history question, but maybe some of you know the answer. Anyone?
Anyone? If you guys have taken a push, maybe. Sewing machine? Steam engine?
Exactly. So the steam engine was part of it, and the spinning jenny. That's the one that I was looking for, right? So there were two changes: the spinning jenny, and also the spinning jenny and the steam engine. So the steam engine was essentially powering the machines in the picture on the right. So you can see the conveyor, the belts and all of that, that's giving the motion to rotate these machines. And that's all powered by a steam engine. And the machine itself is a weaving or a spinning machine. So basically what happened is that all of these artisans were now replaced by these machines that were tendered by both women and children. So at the time of the Industrial Revolutions, we had children in factory. So that's no longer the case, but that used to happen back then. Now, what happened to all of these skilled artisans at the point? They got very mad, and they started what was called the Luddite insurrection. So the Luddites were one group of workers that started protesting and that started breaking these machines because they understood that they were threatening their livelihood. Okay. After this, we also had, for example, the mechanization of agriculture, which is a very similar process. So for example, we went from harvesting using scythes. So those are the tools that these workers are welding in the picture in the left, to harvesting using what's called the combine, which is this tractor on the right picture. And now combines are even more sophisticated than this. And so many of them are self-driving combines. So there's no longer anyone operating those machines. So anyway, through history, we have seen this process where technology is essentially substituting for works that are done by some workers and increasing the demand for other types of workers with other skills. So before we move on, let me bring another question. So that's going to be question 3 on the list that I prepared, Jessica. Perfect. So it seems that we have a winner. And indeed, most of these technologies, because they involve the substitution of capital for labor, they're going to reduce the labor share of the economy. So think of what's happening to this agricultural plant here. Before, it was paying a lot of its revenue to workers because workers were a key part of the production process. But after it undergoes this productive transformation and starts using capital more intensively, the share of revenue created by that farm that is going to be paid to workers is going to be lower. And so the labor share is going to decline. More of the value is going to be generated by capital, by equipment. And so you can think that that's essentially part of what has happened to manufacturing or to some sectors of the US economy in recent years. Now, let's think about another very interesting question. As this example should emphasize, this process of automation is not new. We have seen it playing out historically as well. And so this is going to beg a very interesting question. If automation is not new, if we have been automating jobs over time and so on, how come we still have so many jobs? So let's think about this question. And the answer to this question is going to help us also understand what's going to happen in the future. So the way I want you to think about this question is as follows. Let's imagine that we have a line, this black line that you see there, that represents all of the productive tasks in an economy. So you can have here tasks such as spinning and weaving, which initially we did manually, harvesting, which initially we did manually, assembly and welding, which initially we did manually, and customer support or sales, which initially we did manually. Now, what has happened over time with these tasks? We have had technology automating or mechanizing more of these tasks. So that's a transformation we saw during the Industrial Revolution. That's a transformation we then saw with the mechanization of agriculture. That's a transformation we then saw in the US manufacturing sector. And that's a transformation we then saw as software facilitated online retail or online sales. So you can see that all of these transformations are squeezing, they keep squeezing the range of tasks that are available for humans to do. And so one could imagine that as this keeps happening, we are going to start running out of jobs. What's wrong with my argument? Can anyone tell me? What's the catch? Derek and Andrew.
I will unmute you guys real quick.
The problem with their argument is that as I'm just going to cut to the chase here. The demand for those fewer tasks that are available for humans to complete increases as the use of this technology and capital increases. So thus the amount of people who will be employed in those fewer tasks increases, thus displacing some of the losses that you mentioned here.
Perfect. So that's one part of it, and I agree 100% with your answer. So what's happening as we become more productive at all of these tasks that we automated, there's going to be an increase in the demand for those human tasks that we couldn't automate, right? It's kind of like a productivity effect. The economy becomes more productive at all of these other tasks, and so the wages that we get to pay humans that are doing these tasks that are left for humans to do are going to be very high, and the demand for labor in these tasks is going to be quite high, right? But let's think about the following. Are we doing the exact same tasks that people were doing 200 years ago? Andrew, go ahead.
Also, there's automation to replace some jobs, new jobs also get created. For example, with the spinning jenny, there were also jobs created making spinning jennies, and with the automation of like customer support and buying stuff, there's also a job with creating interfaces for people to buy stuff or for people to interact with a bot that does customer support.
Absolutely. So that's the other part of the answer. So there are these two forces that imply that even though we have had automation, we have not run out of jobs. The first is the productivity effect, which is what Derek mentioned. So automating tasks increases the demand for labor at tasks that we didn't automate. And the second force, which is what Andrew is describing, is that, well, not only we have automation, but also technological progress brings new tasks and new products that didn't exist before. And that also generates labor demand or demand for workers. So let's think about all of the jobs that people are doing right now that didn't exist 50 years ago. So for example, software developers, that's something that didn't exist 50 years ago. Designers, well, we had designers before, but not as much as we have now, right? So design is becoming much more important than before, and this might be part of what Derek had in mind, right? So like if I automate the production of cars, that's going to increase the demand for car designers, right? And so that's another factor that is happening. Driving an Uber, that's a job that didn't exist before and was facilitated by technology. And of course, there are other jobs that we didn't have before, but that as people start becoming wealthier, they are more willing to pay for those jobs. So personal trainers or a yoga instructor or these kind of like wealth jobs, okay? So again, we should be thinking of technological progress as having these two forces. On the one hand, we have the automation or the mechanization of existing tasks. And on the other hand, we are going to have the creation of new tasks or products that can lead to the reemployment or redeployment of labor from the tasks that were automated to those new jobs. So historically, what has happened? Well, you can think that historically, these two forces or these two arrows have advanced at similar speeds. And when these two arrows advance at similar speeds, what's going to happen to the total amount of tasks available for humans? It's going to remain constant, right? So that means that we are still going to have plenty of jobs for humans, that the share of labor is not going to go down because humans are going to retain a key part in their production process and so on. But then, how can we think about what has happened during the last 40 years? And that's going to take us to my next question. So that's question 4 in the list. Jessica, if you can bring it up. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Yes.
Great. So you're absolutely right. So one interpretation of what has happened over the last 40 years is that the arrow for automation has been getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And we are going to discuss what could be some of the factors behind it. While the arrow for new task creation and product creation has not managed to increase as rapid as it did before. And again, we are going to discuss some of the potential factors behind this change in technology. But clearly, what is going to happen when you have this are two things. Well, on the one hand, if automation starts to outpace the rate at which we can create new jobs, you're going to get worsening employment opportunities for those workers who are getting displaced from the production process. So before you were displacing them, but you were creating new employment opportunities, so things were fine. But now you're displacing them, but you're not creating new employment opportunities. And so these workers might experience lower wages, less employment, and they might end up dropping out of the labor force, as we saw in the data. Now, of course, not all of this is bad news. And this is what Derek's point comes as well. This substitution of capital for labor in a widening range of tasks also generates higher productivity. And so we should think that there are two forces. There's a displacement effect, which is some workers are getting displaced. And so those workers are going to do badly. But there's a productivity effect, and we all benefit from this productivity effect. So the productivity effect is thanks to automation, we can now buy cheaper cars. We can now buy cheaper products, right? So that's the productivity effect that is benefiting all of us. But this comes at the expense of some specific workers, in particular, perhaps workers with low levels of education, who are getting displaced from the production process and that are not finding new jobs because we are not introducing as many new tasks and new products to reemploy them. So that's one potential interpretation of what could have happened over the last 40 years. So let's try to think, or let's try to look at the data and let's see what happens when automation runs ahead. This is based on a paper that I have with Darona Semoglu. And the idea in this paper is that we are trying to understand whether automation really creates a displacement effect and whether that affects the workers that are displaced from the production process. So what you have in the figure in the left is a map of the US, which I guess all of you recognize. And each of the little pieces in the map is what's called a commuting zone. So there are 722 commuting zones in the US, you should be thinking of these commuting zones as local labor markets. Okay, so the greater Boston area is going to be one commuting zone, the Bay Area is going to be another commuting zone, and so on. The different colors in this figure indicate to what extent workers in each of these commuting zones have been exposed to competition from industrial robots. The way that we computed it is by looking at the industries that operated locally, and then by taking a look at whether those industries are investing in industrial robots or not. So for example, you can see that areas around Detroit and Michigan and Ohio are highly exposed to automation by industrial robots, because what key industry is located in those areas? You can say it in the chat. Exactly, so cars manufacturing is in that region, and that has been one industry that has undergone a lot of this technological transformation that we've discussed. Now, Texas, some parts of Texas are also highly exposed. What industry do you think is located there? Where there's some oil and there's some automation in that sector as well, but in that case, it's petrochemicals, so derivatives from oil. So the petrochemical industry in Texas, there's a lot of automation in that industry as well. And so our model tells us that there's a lot of exposure of workers in those communities to industrial robots. Now, what happens when we zoom into these labor markets and we ask, well, let's see what's happening to workers there. And the theory that I just outlined suggests that workers in these communities should be experiencing the displacement effects from this automation. Now, remember that this automation is going to benefit everyone in the US, because we all benefit from cheaper cars made in Detroit, right? But the key thing is what's happening to those workers. Can we detect evidence of this displacement effect? And we can. In particular, in this figure in the right, what we are doing is that we are plotting changes in employment in each of these communities between 1990 and 2007 against the measure of exposure to competition by industrial robots in the horizontal axis. And what you can see here, and this is kind of like fitting a regression line through these points, is that as I start increasing the exposure to competition by industrial robots, what happens to employment in these regions? It goes down, right? So you see that these regions are doing worst in terms of employment, which would be evidence of the displacement effect. Now, you can also see the same for wages, and you can also see that people are dropping out of the labor force in these regions, which is consistent with what we saw in terms of the overall decline in labor force participation. Now, let me show you another figure from a more recent paper. In this figure, what we did is that we tried to go beyond the case of robots, and we tried to compute an index of how much displacement different groups in the US have experienced since the 1980s. And so in the figure in the left, each of the balloons represents one demographic group. So for example, one balloon can be young white men between 25 to 35 years of age with a college degree. And we have 500 balloons defined by the gender, education, age, race, and immigrant status of all workers in the US. And the reason why we're looking at these 500 groups is because in the data, they tend to specialize in very different industries, and within industry in very different types of tasks. And in particular, the way that our methodology works is by looking at workers who specialize in routine tasks. Routine tasks are things such as welding, which are very repetitive. So welding a car, the car is always going to come in the same shape and at the same time. And the only thing that you need to do is go and weld it. It requires a lot of skill, but is routine in the sense that you always have to make the same movement. So if you know a little bit about software, you don't immediately recognize that that's very easy to automate, because you can write a software program that can do the welding, right? Customer service, a lot of customer service is kind of like the same questions you're going to ask people 10 times, and then you're going to point them to something that's also very easy to automate using software. And so these two would be examples of routine tasks. And so what you're seeing in this figure is a measure of how much displacement effect do we expect different groups in the US economy to have experienced since 1980 to 2016. And what you can see is that the groups that have been exposed the most to the displacement effect of automation are workers that are high school dropouts or that have a high school degree, but no more than a high school degree, right? But for example, when you look at workers who completed their college degree, so those are the blue bubbles, or workers that went on ahead to complete a post-college degree or a postgraduate degree, those are the yellow bubbles. You see very little exposure to displacement. So again, this is showing us that yes, automation could benefit us through the productivity effect, but the displacement effect of automation is creating inequality because it affects disproportionately groups with low levels of education. Okay, so before I go to the next slide, let's remember that we all agree that one potential interpretation of what has happened over the last 40 years is that there was a shift in the balance of automation and new task creation. So now let's try to understand what could be some of the factors behind that shift. What is pushing us to do more automation instead of new task creation? So that's going to be question 5 in my list. Jessica, if you can pull it up.
Yes, I will do that right now.
Perfect, thank you. So which of these factors do you think contributed to this shift in technology? Perfect. So I need some volunteers. So who wants to tell me why advances in computing power, or what do you have in mind here, specifically when we are talking about advances in computing power?
Does someone want to raise their hand and I can unmute you?
Mark?
With the ability to compute more stuff, you can calculate the movement of robots and stuff, which would allow for more automation. But it would also allow for more communication systems to do stuff like sales.
Absolutely. So all of these systems are data hungry. They require lots of computations and so on. So it would be very hard to automate many of these tasks without the advanced computers that we have today, right? And so this is actually very interesting because when you look at the capacity of computers to do computation, so advances in computing power, they have been doubling every 2 years. So every 2 years, we have a doubling in computing power. So that's amazing. And we have had that since the 1970s. This empirical regularity is known as Moore's law. It's not a rule of nature or a law of nature that is going to continue into the future, but at least it has been the case that when you look at computing power per microchip, it has doubled every 2 years. And you can immediately see how this is going to lead to huge advances in computers, right? So everything that doubles every 2 years, it's going to grow exponentially very rapidly. So this is one of the main factors that has contributed to this shift. Now, some of the other factors, and you are also absolutely right in pointing them out, are taxes. So for example, the taxes on labor, if you have a firm and you want to hire a worker, you're going to end up paying in the US a tax on labor of 25% per worker. Whereas if you want to complete the same task using equipment or software, you just need to pay a tax of 5%. So at some level, workers and capital or software are not on equal footing when it comes to the tax system. So for example, you might remember Bill Gates making an argument along these lines recently. And the final element that has been very important in driving some of this transformation has been the aging of the population, which is something that we discussed earlier, and Seth told us something about it. So in particular, when you look at aging, there are many countries in the world that are aging very rapidly. The US is one of them. but there are actually other countries that are aging much more rapidly than the US. So for example, Japan and Germany. And when you look at who are the countries that are investing very heavily in industrial automation, you're going to see that most of those robots are made in Japan and Germany. And the reason, and it makes a lot of sense, is that when the population starts aging, you're not going to have workers. You're not going to have workers to employ in your factories. And so it really makes a lot of sense to develop these automation technologies as a substitute for an aging population. Okay. Mark, I don't know if you have a question.
I'll unmute you. Give me 1 second.
Yeah,
Go
I do
ahead.
have a question. Could the relationship be also inverse? So as the population gets older, there's more need for some sort of like output of products. So they, as a need for substitution for labor, they do more automation. Is that the
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you repeat the, like, something that I said in the mirror? I didn't get what you said. Can you repeat that? Oh, mute again. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So you mentioned that because they're because of more automation, they're getting older. I was asking if it could be the other way around as well. Whereas when in a population that's getting older, there's less labor, and maybe like the companies have more need for automation. Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
absolutely. So that's exactly what I have in mind. So maybe like I didn't explain it correctly, but what I have in mind is exactly what you just said. So when the workforce gets older, companies are going to struggle to find workers, right? And imagine that the population starts getting older. What's going to happen to the wages that companies need to pay to attract workers? They're going to go up, right? They're going to go up because labor is hard to find in an economy where workers are getting older. And so they're going to have more incentives to automate. So I think that you and I are exactly on the same page. The causality is mostly like the population gets older and this generates incentives for automation by companies. Okay. So now let me conclude because we're running out of time. Let me conclude with something very quick, which is, well, let's now think about the future of work. And when we're thinking about the future of work, the key thing is artificial intelligence, right? What is artificial intelligence going to do to this balance between new task creation and automation? And I think that the answer is that it really depends. And it depends because artificial intelligence can be used for many things. So artificial intelligence can be used to automate tasks. So for example, we can use artificial intelligence to automate trading, to create self-driving cars and trucks, to further automate customer service. Or we can have, for example, industrial robots with more capabilities now that we're going to have artificial intelligence. For example, industrial robots that can see. The current batch of industrial robots, they cannot see. But with advances in machine vision, probably you can have robots that can see. But at the same time, artificial intelligence, you can also think that it can be used to introduce new tasks, jobs, and to improve our educational system, which is something that is going to be good for the future of labor, right? And so, for example, artificial intelligence can be used to have personalized education, to provide instantaneous translation. So you can teach to people all across the world. You can also have personalized and real-time healthcare. So if you are, for example, in the pharmaceutical companies, you can use artificial intelligence to test drugs, hundreds of combinations or millions of combinations immediately. And artificial intelligence can also be used to develop new products. So you can see that artificial intelligence is not necessarily bad. It's going to depend on what applications of artificial intelligence we developed. And if we develop more applications of the automation kind, then probably we're going to continue seeing the types of outcomes that we saw over the last 40 years, increasing inequality and declining participation. But this is also an opportunity. We could develop algorithms that instead of automating labor, complement labor, and that can help us put people to work and that can help us create employment opportunities for a wide range of people in the US. So that's also an invitation for many of you. Technology is not something that comes like in a given shape. We decide how we want to use technology. And depending on how we use technology, that's going to affect the labor outcome markets that we get in return. So that's all I have for you. Thanks so much for the very active participation and for answering questions. And I don't know if you're going to have time for questions, Jessica, but if we do, I'm happy to take 1 or 2 questions or whatever you want. Thanks,
Okay,
everyone.
I think it's fine if we go 10 to 15 minutes over time today. It's completely fine. So I did see a question in the chat. Let me pull it up real quick.
Perfect. Dario, right? Dario.
Oh yes, that was the question.
Perfect. Great. So that's great. So let me go to this figure. So there's a key question that comes out like every time that you're doing econometrics, which is, well, you have 2 variables, right? So here I'm trying to connect changes in employment in these regions to the competition from industrial robots. But of course, what's the key challenge when you're trying to make any causal statement of this type? That there might be a third variable related to both, right? So maybe these areas that are in purple in my figure, those are also areas that have experienced a lot of trade competition. And there has been a lot of discussion of whether those areas are doing poorly, not because of automation, but just because of competition from other countries in international markets. And you could see how that would generate very similar effects. So what we did in the paper empirically is that we created actually 2 measures. We have a measure of exposure to competition by other countries, and we have a measure of exposure to competition by robots. And then you can put these 2 measures together in your regression analysis. And what you find is that both of them matter. And both of them are actually affecting very different industries. So if you want to think, for example, of globalization in recent years, it has affected mostly the apparel and textile industry, whereas automation has affected mostly the automobile and petrochemicals industry. And those industries are located in very different industries, very different regions in the US. So that's how you can untangle the effects from trade from the effects from automation empirically.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that question.
And by the way, for those of you who are interested, there's a fantastic paper by David Autor and co-authors that is called The China Syndrome. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this paper, but it's a paper that studies empirically what were the effects of rising Chinese import competition in US labor markets.
Cool. If you could send that into the chat for anyone who's interested, that would be great.
Perfect.
Just the name of the paper would be awesome.
Yes.
And also, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to either message them to me or send them into the chat.
Yes, absolutely. And there's people saying something in the chat. So yeah, when there's a third variable that can influence both the outcome and your variable of interest, that's called a confounder. And a lot of econometrics is about controlling for those confounders. That's one alternative. Or finding sources of variation that are exogenous to those confounders so that you can untangle the causal effect of your variable of interest on the outcome.
Cool. I think
and that's the paper. There's a link to the paper already there.
Yes, thanks for putting it into the chat for everyone. If no one has any questions, oh, there is a question. Okay. What states have found a balance in robot usage and employment? So
yeah,
I'm guessing so where both of them allow the labor to be balanced.
Exactly. So like, I guess that in the US, it's hard to find examples, but there are good international examples. So for example, one country that has found a good balance between robot usage and employment has been Germany. So Germany has actually much more robots than the US, but they're not experiencing such a big increase in inequality or such a reduction in employment and participation as the US has seen recently. And one potential reason for that is that Germany, for example, could be investing much more in worker retraining. So they have this apprenticeship system where workers can be retrained inside the firms to do other tasks and other jobs, and that might be part of the difference. Okay, so again, this also tells you that the effects of technology do not depend only on the technology itself, but also on the institutions surrounding the technology and on whether the economy is good or not at retraining those workers and redeploying them to new tasks and jobs.
Is the US currently doing that, or?
I
If
think that we are
not-
not doing that as much as we could. So for example, we are not educating people as much as we did in the past. So if you look at the figure that I had initially, okay, for example, this figure, you can see that in the red lines, there's a slowdown in the rate at which we are pushing people through college. And so actually for men, we have not made any progress in getting men to complete college at a higher rate than they did before. And so that's might be part of why we have experienced adverse outcomes in the US. We have not invested as much in education as we could or should.
I see. Okay. Do we have another question in here? Yeah, someone asked what was going on with Philadelphia, and another person answered manufacturing and
Yep.
oil refining.
Exactly, I agree with that answer that Vivian gave us there.
Cool. And I had a question. So since like automation is taking over so many jobs right now, what are some like jobs that you think will be retained for a very long time in the future?
Yeah, so there's very interesting research by David Deming, who is a professor at Harvard, that has been looking at what are kind of like the skills that are becoming more valuable in the labor market these days. And that's, I think, a way of answering your question. And what he finds is that the workers who are experiencing a big increase in employment opportunities are workers who have a combination of two skills: analytical skills. So you're all fine because, you know, like that's essentially like economics and math and so on. But they also find that there's also another type of workers who are getting an increase in wages and demand are workers with interpersonal skills. And so, you know, like it's becoming increasingly important to be able to communicate your ideas to the public and so on. Because think, for example, of AI. So maybe AI comes up with a decision, but you want someone that can understand that decision and explain it to a firm or to the shareholders of a firm. And so it's not only about analytical skills or software programmers, but also a lot about interpersonal skills and communication skills.
I see.
And that's the link to the paper by David Deming, who is also doing fascinating research on this topic.
Awesome. Do we have any more questions from anyone? You guys can definitely raise your hand and ask questions if you have any. Okay, so yeah, feel free to direct message me, and I'll give it a few minutes if anyone has any questions that you guys want to input.
So I received another question in the chat. I'm happy to take it if you want.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So this is a question from Vivian asking what is going to happen if at some point AI matches human intelligence? And I think that that's a very interesting question, because when I was talking about AI here, I was talking about narrow AI, what's called narrow AI, which are essentially applications of machine learning algorithms that, thanks, Daniel, machine learning algorithms that can be used for narrow tasks, for very specific tasks, but we're not talking about general human intelligence level artificial intelligence, right? So there's another, but this is more speculative. What's going to happen if someday we develop artificial intelligence that is essentially as smart as a human being? And at that point, I have no idea what's going to happen, because, yeah, like essentially at that point, that means that algorithms are going to be able to do all of the things that we can do. And so it's going to be hard. And I presume that at that point, it's all going to boil down to who owns those algorithms, right? Because whoever owns those algorithms is going to control all of the resources in the world immediately, almost mechanically. But the question is that I'm not sure if you're ever going to get there. So like, I'm not sure if we can develop artificial intelligence that can be as smart as human level general intelligence. That's kind of like an open question, whether that's doable or not. And so it's something that is more for the future, I would say.
Awesome. Well, I guess it's sort of reassuring that in the short term, we won't have human level AI just yet. But yeah, so since we have no more questions, I don't think, I think we can conclude our speaker seminar for today. So Professor Restrepo, thank you so much again for
Perfect. Thanks for the
sharing all
questions.
of this. And yeah, I learned a lot about like the balance between automation and also like new task creation and stuff, and also the importance of higher level education.
Thanks so much. And again, like I look forward to meeting many of you in person in upcoming years when you come here to BU or any other institution to do your undergrads in econ or math or whatever it is you want to do. But hopefully, like if I have convinced at least one of you that economics is useful and can be applied to interesting questions, like I think that my job here is done. So thanks so much for being here. And now I'll let you go to the results, which is why we are here, right?
That's awesome. And then I will share your email and slideshow with everyone so that they
Yes,
can
feel free
reference
to
it.
email me
in
if you have
case.
any questions or you want to talk about any of this, okay?
All right. Thanks again for coming.
Thanks,
And
everyone.
it was an awesome presentation. We learned a lot.
Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the competition.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.